Trump crack-up, which means...
Yeah, well, those four unravelings. First, the unraveling of the Western alliance, the post-Cold War alliance. Second, the unraveling that DJ just described, our democratic order. Third, the unraveling of our domestic security, the sense that we live in a relatively free, at least free of state violence, and we can no longer be sure of that. And then the fourth, and to me the most important and the primary one, is the unraveling of Trump's mind, if you want to put it that way. I do think, I've never met a president who wasn't more full of himself at the end of his term than at the beginning. They all become a little egotistical. If you start with Donald Trump's ego, you're really going places. And so, if you look through history at the minds of people who are driven by a lust for power and who have tyrannical tendencies, the arc of history bends toward degradation. There's just not many cases where somebody was becoming more and more power hungry, more and more tyrannical, and they said, oh, I better put on the brakes here and become more moderate. That just doesn't happen. You get this process of mental deterioration that's in part caused by the way the lust for power makes you drunk on power, really, and is insatiable. Partly because as you're driven by the lust for power, the environment you create around you becomes more sycophantic and has less checks. And partly because the people in this country have a tendency to lose the habits of democratic self-government. And so I was looking at these classical historians, Tacitus and people like that, Sallust, and then later ones, Plutarch, Edward Gibbon. They had a front row seat of tyranny, and so they really understood it pretty well. And they talk about the fact that citizens lose the capacity for persuasion, for compromise, for interpersonal trust, the very fabric of democratic society. And when that is torn away, as Edward Gibbon writes, you get what he calls every page of history is stained with civil blood. And I think we're heading toward that kind of decay.
To hear the two of you talk about an insatiable lust for power and regime change, it makes me feel obliged to ask you this, both a short answer question, which is, are you confident there will be elections in November, and that the elections will go on as elections typically do?
I know at the very least, that's not clear, and I think it's something that people began to worry about even more again over the last several weeks. When the FBI raided the Board of Elections down in Georgia, in Fulton County, people said, well, this is about Trump's obsession with the fact that he falsely claims over and over again that he won the 2020 election. But I think a lot of people, especially when they discovered that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was there, I think a lot of people saw this as an attempt to affect the election. And then Trump himself spoke of nationalizing the rules of the election. And then he said in 15 places, which sounded like democratic states. And the beginning of that statement he made was Republicans should take over the elections. So I've spoken in the last couple of weeks to a lot of lawyers, anti-Trump administration lawyers, I would say, who are genuinely concerned about basic things like, will there be ICE agents at the polls, as Steve Bannon has threatened? Will he call out troops? Will this be about reducing turnout? So I still like to hope that our decentralized system of elections makes it more difficult for him to disrupt them in this way. But everything he's done so far, I think, is, and maybe by design, is to make us more and more uneasy about whether these elections will be on the level.
David, you have more than a hope?
Yeah, I have every confidence that we'll have an election. I think he's internalized that we are a democracy and that he needs to step down in 2028. And I say that for two reasons. One, historical. I was really moved in 2020. I read a book by Samuel Huntington, the late great political scientist from Harvard, and the subtitle of the book was The Promise of Disharmony. And he argues that every couple decades, America goes through what he calls a moral convulsion, where people want to burn everything down, people get disgusted, social distrust collapses, a passionate generation comes on the scene, new form of communications technology. He said this happens in the 1770s with the Revolutionary period, happened in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson populism, 1890s, where you get these economic depressions, racial terrorism, mass political corruption, poverty. And it happened in the 1960s with bombings, assassinations, and so on. And writing in 1981, he says, I don't know if I believe in these cycles, but if the cycle holds, sometime around the second decade of the 21st century, we'll go through another moral convulsion. And I'm like, well done, Professor Huntington. And the good news is you come out of them.
Yeah.
That the society reacts, and we have a culture change. We don't go back, and in this case, we should not go back to the pre-Trump era, but we go forward. And the second reason, I just have tremendous faith in the power of the people manning our institutions, in the military, in the election officials on the state level, Republicans on the state level. So I think we'll hold.
There's one convulsion you didn't have on your list, David, and that was the Civil War.
We had elections then, I should point out, though.
And I think you've done the same. I've been doing a lot of reading over the recent years in the 1850s into the 1860s, both the nature of the polarization, the anger, the violence, the threats against elected officials, the depth of the mistrust. And I find this period much closer to that than to some of these other periods where, yes, we've had a lot of fierce arguments in our history. Again, I share your confidence in the people running elections at the local